All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chief Martech TV, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Wait, no, that's the other Episode 2. This is Episode 2, the Myths and Monsters of Agile Marketing. Really excited to have as our special guest for this show, Roland Smart. It's hard to find anyone smarter, right? Roland is the, sorry about that, VP of Social and Community Marketing at Oracle. He's also the author of the fantastic book, The Agile Marketer, published by Wiley. We're both friends of the Wiley brand. He is also the co-host of the Marketing Agility podcast that he does with another Agile marketing pioneer, Frank Days. Wow, frequent keynote speaker on Agile marketing around the world. Was a fantastic speaker on Agile marketing at the last Martech conference. And I'm sure the list could go on. But we're going to do a bit of a follow-up with you separately for a Q&A on Chief Martech about your background and the fun stuff you're doing at Oracle. But for today's conversation, I figured let's just dive right in, because I think most of the audience here has certainly heard Agile marketing, possibly at different stages of deciding how to practice it. So maybe just as a way to warm this up, do you want to start by just talk to us about Agile marketing and what makes that different from any other kind of Agile, just Agile software development, Agile management in general?
Sure. Well, thanks for the warm welcome. I'm psyched to be here and chat with you again. So why Agile marketing? I think that, for me and in my book, part of what I think I use to sort of frame up the conversation and to start to introduce the topic is this idea that marketers are being asked or aspire to become stewards of customer experience. And that's something that's sort of beyond just being the steward of the brand. And we have a unique vantage point and purview where we can look across the entire customer experience and we can measure and observe what the experience is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The challenge that we have, or that a lot of marketers have, is that we don't necessarily have purview over all of those experiences. We don't necessarily have the ability to actually change all of those experiences or touch points. A lot of those are managed by other teams within the company. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, I would say, we might want to focus on product management, because product management certainly owns most of the experience in the product. And as marketers, right, we're trying to bake marketing into the product more and more. And a lot of the experiences that we want to have influence over are in the product, or at least we want to find ways of making the experience out of the product feel like it's cut from the same cloth as the experience in the product. The problem is that product management has gone through this revolution, which was driven by Agile. And, over, I think it's 17 years ago now, the Agile Manifesto was written, right? And that's led to this incredible revolution to the way that product management is done. But the problem is that marketers haven't gone through a complementary modernization of our own that would help keep us in alignment with product management so we can collaborate really effectively with them and have the kind of influence that we'd like to have across the customer experience. And so I think one of the things that's driving marketers to adopt Agile is we need to be able to understand the way that product management works. And that means understanding Agile so that we can have influence across the customer experience. Now, it also turns out that we're managing more software in our own world than ever before. And Agile happens to be the best practice for managing software. So there's other reasons behind it, but those two are real significant drivers from my perspective. When it comes to your question about is Agile in the marketing context different than Agile in the product management context, I would say yes. I think the values and the principles are largely the same. I think that we need to interpret Agile for the marketing context. And I think that when you're showing sort of the spectrum of methods here, I think this is a good example of what does interpreting Agile in the marketing context really mean? And so, I think of a hierarchy where Agile is really an approach.
Mm.
Methods are the things that basically make that approach actionable, right? Make that philosophy actionable. And methods are really just a collection of underlying practices. There are probably 100 different Agile practices. And so you can pick and choose a set of practices from that 100 and bundle those up into your method. And so from the product management side, they have kind of a history of having what I would describe as more prescriptive methods, meaning more underlying practices, and they adhere to those practices more rigorously. Marketers aren't used to working in really, really prescriptive ways. And so when we start implementing Agile in the marketing context, I think my experience has been, and the experience of others who have come on the Marketing Agility podcast has been, that it's much better to start with something less prescriptive, more flexible, but that still, uses some key Agile practices. So some of the, I would say, starter Agile practices that I would expect to see in almost any implementation would be things like running a retrospective, having a backlog, grooming that backlog, sharing that backlog transparently with others in the company, trying to have a scoping practice for the different tasks that are in that backlog, things like that.
So actually, let me ask you this, because I think it is perhaps one of these myths or monsters of what's under the umbrella of Agile is actually potentially a very large set of methods or variations on these methods. Feels like the software world invents a new variation of it every few months. So for like a marketer who says, okay, listen, I get it. I need to be agile, lowercase a agile. I want to get started. Where do I begin? I don't know. First step is pick up a copy of the Agile Marketer, read that cover to cover, buy a copy for everyone on your team. That's the best place to start.
Right. Exactly.
But a distilled version of that is like, what's the, maybe this is the way to word it, is what are usually the wrong ways that you see people try and start Agile and it just
So I alluded to one of them before, which is that, one of the things that's driving marketers to adopt Agile is that we're trying to collaborate more effectively and keep up with product management, stay in sync with product management, right? If you imagine a world in which product management is using Agile and they're releasing something on a monthly basis and pivoting as they're getting feedback based on that thing that they're releasing, but you've got the marketers in another silo thinking 6 months ahead, you can see how that's just not going to work, because the developers are going to be changing direction and marketers are going to be making these investments that take 6 months to play out. And when they get to that 6 month marks, they're just going to be out of sync. And that's going to be really frustrating for both parties. So marketers oftentimes come to it from the perspective, okay, we need to take a page out of product management's book and understand their approach. And I think then many marketers realize, well, we need to actually adopt elements of this approach. Hand in hand with that, I think part of what we've seen is that marketers have a tendency to, since they're in the mode of accepting influence, they also listen to product management when they say, well, you should start with Scrum, because Scrum is this method that we use. But in practice, actually, Scrum is, generally speaking, too prescriptive for a team that is just starting with Agile. And so, there's a case study in my book with a guy named Mike McKinnon who talked about a sort of process that his team went through where they started with something that was too prescriptive. The team completely rejected it, and it really set them back. And then they ended up starting with something that was very, very lightweight and less prescriptive. And over time, as they got more familiar with the method, they started adding practices in and tailoring the practice to their team, company, culture. And then it started sort of creeping back towards Scrum, right? They actually landed on something that they call Scrumban. But the point is, like, it's not like there is a method called Kanban or Scrum that has these exact set of practices. It's more that you're going to pick and choose the practices that are the right fit for your organization from the portfolio of underlying practices, and you can give it a name if you want. You can call it Kanban and Scrum. I mean, I think Kanban and Scrum have as general definitions, they can be distinguished from each other and should be distinguished from each other. They've got pros and cons associated with them, but ultimately, as marketers use them, they're gonna iterate on the method itself. In fact, the practice of doing the retrospective, right, which is that is one foundational Agile practice. It's not just about doing a retrospective on the work that you just produced in the last iteration. It's also about looking at how is the Agile method working for you after each iteration, and how can you evolve your practices, throw some out if they're not working for you, try other ones that might work better for you. So when I think about what does it take for a marketer to get started, yes, I think they need to do a bunch of their homework. I think they need a context also where either their business is being disrupted or the business is moving sufficiently quickly that Agile is actually a good fit, right? Agile isn't a good fit for everything. There's lots of contexts where waterfall actually makes more sense. I think that you need to have a sort of internal Agilist, somebody who's going to kind of own the Agile practice, who's going to shepherd along and tailor that method, who's going to both provide oversight to the implementation teams, but also who's going to sell up into the organization and try and get executive management on board with it.
Well, that's actually one of the things I want to, just shift into a little bit quickly there, is because, as people are getting started with this, there's scenarios where, okay, so a small little group, sort of unbeknownst to the rest of the organization, says, okay, well, we're going to start doing this Agile practice, and we're going to see how we can make this work,
Sure.
and we'll go from there. And then there's that sort of the vision of the CMO comes to a marketing conference, attends a session, and it's like, Agile marketing, yes, we really should be doing that. Okay, mandated. Now Agile marketing, and I'm sure 100 variations in between these two.
Yeah.
What do you see works?
So this slide you're sharing comes out of a presentation that Frank Days and I produced, basically and it's entirely anecdotal evidence from what we've heard on the Marketing Agility podcast. So this isn't based on research. We'd love to do some research, and we may very well have a chance to do that in the relatively near future. But what we hear is that CMOs are not very often coming to the table and saying, okay, I am sold on Agile and I understand it, and we're going to adopt it. That's very rare. I think where that is the case, we've seen some impressive results, because that's somebody who really does get it and is willing to invest in it and do what it takes to make it successful. The vast majority of the case, though, the dominant pattern that we see in the market today is more that you've got entrepreneurial marketers inside of a company who have picked up Agile not necessarily because they are thinking on a strategic level about the role that Agile is playing. I think what we talk about in our respective books about, the larger arc about why Agile is being adopted, but more because it's something that is going to give them an advantage in their day-to-day work. They've seen product management use it. They've been turned onto it by, maybe one of their peers in the company or other practitioners in the marketplace, and they're going to give it a try. I sort of view this as kind of the pilot stage, where even in really big companies like Oracle, like there's lots of marketers who are sort of piloting Agile within their team. Even at medium and smaller, medium-sized companies, you see Agile popping up in different silos. The challenge for these companies, though, is that they don't necessarily have executive buy-in, and so that's where the job of the Agilist comes in, which is that they've got to tell the story of those pilots and demonstrate value and start the work of getting executive management to support it. Because if that doesn't happen, what we see typically is that entrepreneurial leader who's brought it into the company, like if that person leaves, the team's going to fall back on the practices that they know better and that they're more comfortable with, which is typically waterfall. And so you're in a fairly high risk context if you've got pilots that exist, but you aren't actually actively trying to sell up into management. And that's sort of what the last column is here, where you can reach management, you can prove to them the value, and you can sort of get the adoption to be driven from the top down and from those entrepreneurial leaders who are bringing it in from the bottom up. That's where we see the most success. Now, that's obviously only 30% of the people that we talk to where we see that. But I think that's the most reliable way of getting to success. And one of the things that I think is worth pointing out is that getting from that middle column to the column on the right side here isn't like one way of helping with that may be not just relying on your internal Agilist, but bringing in management consultant. And we see management, traditional like change management oriented consultants in the marketplace who are aggressively building out agile marketing practices.
Yeah, I saw like McKinsey has like a whole agile marketing practice. I'm like, wow, okay. We know agile marketing is becoming real when McKinsey's got a practice for it.
Totally, because I think what that validates from my perspective is that it is actually quite challenging to educate executive management about agile. It requires that management get comfortable with some things that they're traditionally very, very uncomfortable with. Like the idea, for example, of putting out a minimum viable product, which isn't, a fully baked vision of something, but it's just something small that you're going to put out there to get feedback and iterate on. Like many executives are very uncomfortable with that idea. I think, Agile is also, when you've got Agile implemented at scale, it tends to put more emphasis on bottom-up driven innovation. Like 60% of the innovation and ideas are going to come from the bottom up versus this top-down reality. And so I think that is not easy for executive management to really embrace. So there's other things that I could point to there, but those are some of the challenges that these traditional consulting companies can help the internal Agilist tackle.
So I'm going to use that as a segue into this next topic. And I'm realizing that 30 minutes is just, a ridiculously constrained amount of time to tap all the things I want to pull out of your brain here. But, we're going to try and squeeze in two more topics.
Okay.
One is this thing. Okay, so talking about how Agile scales. Like once you have that organization, you've got some of the individual groups that have had success.
Yeah.
Top-down management is now ready to say, okay, let's spread this throughout the organization. Yep. I think there's a lot of mystery, particularly to the marketing community, of, okay, well, how do you do that? How do you coordinate all these different independent Agile units? Do you want to share a bit about that?
So there's two different dimensions to this. I think you're the slide you're sharing here about the Spotify, what I consider to be a modernized matrix team structure, or a more contemporary matrix structure for a team. This is very effective at driving alignment across horizontally across implementation teams. So in this model, you've got squads, or what in the parlance of Agile, it's basically just a small cross-functional team.
It's like a single Agile team there, like
right. So a 7 or 8 person team. They've got design, development, testing, all in that group, and they're probably, in the best case scenario, they're focused on a particular business initiative or a particular area of your marketing experience. So let's say, for example, you've got 3 Agile teams that are focused on your website. One is focused on, the demand and lead capture elements of your website. One is maybe focused on content, and the third is focused on something else, right? But then you have got other squads focused on other parts of your marketing operation, whatever those are. Well, the question comes up is that because these are relatively small teams, and there could be a large number of them, how do you keep them in alignment about things like brand, interactions, interaction experience, user experience, and so on? So what Spotify introduces is this idea of tribes are squads that are working on adjacent parts of your marketing. So all the web teams, those squads would be part of a tribe, and they would have occasional meetings where they talk about what's happening across the entire web platform. But then there's this concept of chapters and guilds, and these are sort of the horizontal groupings on this chart, where you might bring together all the UX people across all the squads, even though they're focused on very different parts of your marketing, to make sure that there's consistency with the way you're thinking about and implementing UX. Or it might be something else. It might be about, how you're leveraging, there might be a guild around personas and how you're using personas, or even a guild around a stage of the funnel that you're working on. So the purpose of these structures is just to keep these, this large number of implementation teams in alignment. And it really kind of is predicated on the idea that these teams have backlogs that are being transparently shared. That also goes a long way to keep folks in alignment. Now, that's horizontal alignment. There's another kind of alignment that's worth talking about, which is the alignment that we have vertically up and down the organization to make sure that these implementation teams are staying in alignment with executive management. And that's where, we hear from marketers that we bring on the Marketing Agility podcast. One of the things that's come up is frameworks like the OKR framework, which has, I think, been popularized by Google, was introduced to them by John Doerr, who's a pretty well-known venture capitalist. And the OKR framework it's actually quite simple. Each individual in the company basically chooses between 3 and 5 goals for the quarter. And then each one of those goals gets a couple of metrics associated with it to assess whether or not the goal was met. And the goals cascade down through the company. So John Doerr's example was about, a football team and how the owner of the football team, some of his top goals are like winning the Super Bowl and, making sure that every seat is filled. But then as you move down the chain, like you're seeing much more specific goals cascading down from those very, very high level goals, and resetting these on a quarterly basis, and also sharing these transparently so that everybody in the company can look up what everybody else's OKRs are. This is one way of making sure that these implementation teams stay in close alignment with the strategic direction of the company.
Got it. So I guess where's the intersection there between so if that top-down OKR framework and then the actual agile process, planning or something that kind of where does that intersection happen?
So it happens. From my experience, it happens in the backlog. I think that it tends to happen on the epic level, where within your backlog you're going to have all the things you're going to work on, but you roll those up into higher level themes, which are we call epics, and those epics should basically tie into your objectives, and your objectives should tie up to the executive level objectives. I think the challenge that I see marketers dealing with is that Agile is it really thrives on constant and immediate feedback that you're getting from your web analytics platform, social media, from instrumentation in the product or your site, whereas strategic input from a channel partner, from some research that takes a quarter to run, or from a customer advisory board, right? That feedback comes in maybe at a quarterly basis. And so, there needs to be a regular process by which that strategic feedback makes its way into your backlog. And that needs to happen on a regular cadence. I mean, I think having executive management participate in a sprint review process on a regular cadence, it doesn't have to be every sprint review, but on at least quarterly at an absolute minimum. I would say monthly is a better target, is a good way of kind of making rubber hit the road and ensuring that the stuff that's in your backlog is really tying back to the strategy that the executive leadership is setting.
Cool. Well, yeah, definitely. So for the listeners here in the audience, if you haven't yet, I definitely recommend downloading that Spotify paper. Yeah. If you do a Google search for Scaling Agile at Spotify, it certainly describes in more detail the architecture, the team architecture they use. It's in the context of software development, but yeah, I think you can sort of map, given Roland's insights here, how that might fit for marketing.
I don't think, even Agile being implemented on the software side, they haven't completely figured it out, right? There's still lots of challenges that they're facing particularly when it comes to scaling Agile into an enterprise. there's a lot of people who are really trying to develop these frameworks. Like there's something called the SAFe framework, which is, I don't think anybody on the marketing side of the house is trying to adopt or even interpret yet. But, the reality, my point is just that product management is ahead of us when it comes to their overall experience implementing Agile. And so I think it's not just that we are taking a page from their book from what they've done so far. We need to continue taking a page from their book and working with them to get more insight into what they're discovering about how to make Agile scale into the enterprise.
Awesome. Well, listen, I want to leave at least 5 minutes here for if any of our loyal folks here in the audience would like to join in the conversation. I'll unlock the seat here, and just feel free to call in. If nobody calls in, I do have another question for Roland. Actually, I have a long list of questions for Roland, but I might be able to squeeze in one last one if we don't have a caller.
Sure.
This is your opportunity.
Yes, I saw somebody liked some of the things we were saying. So let us know if you have a follow-up question.
That's a good sign. All right, well, we'll give it to the count of three, and then I'll jump in with a question.
Sounds good.
3, 2, 1. So I guess another question I have that I hear a lot, I'd really love to hear your perspective on this, is one of the challenges that's perhaps different with marketing than a typical software team or a product team is usually the software teams and the product teams tend to be almost entirely staffed internally or have, dedicated contractors or something like that. Whereas a lot of marketing teams are also working with agencies and other service providers whom the participants from the agency side, perhaps have a certain variance, or they have these layers with account management.
Yep.
How do marketers map that into adopting Agile?
Yeah, so this is again a topic that comes up a bunch. I could summarize by saying, when it comes to contractors, I think having contractors on a small cross-functional team is fine. I think so long as the contractors don't outnumber your full-time employees. And I think it works best when you've got long-term relationships with contractors. I mean, I actually think it's probably the best way to do recruiting when it comes to building out Agile teams, is to bring in contractors, let them work with one of your Agile teams. If they do really, really well, that's going to be your pipeline for, new talent to bring in full time. I think overall, the pendulum is swinging in the direction of marketers realizing that they need to take more of this work internally. I think that's why you're seeing more pressure. That's one of several pressures that are impacting the agency right now. Marketers, Agile is causing marketers to shift their mindset from a campaign way of thinking, where something has a beginning, a middle, and an end, to a product-oriented way of thinking, where you're investing in something that has ongoing value, and you're going to continue iterating on it for the foreseeable future. It's not going to be something that you walk away from, right? So agencies can work when you're just going to basically take a Agile project and just outsource the whole thing to an agency. So that can work. The problem with that is that oftentimes for these teams to be really effective, they need to be pretty tied in. In the Spotify model, we talked about how do you keep one Agile team in alignment with all the rest of them. So unless the agency is fully in and participating in that process, in that matrix org, it's hard to keep them in alignment. So that's a challenge as well. I think the other sort of outside influence that can have a significant impact, we touched on before, is the role of the consultancy. That consultant can help at two different levels. One, they can help on the implementation level, where, for example, you can bring in somebody to give your team Scrum training or certification in Agile, and that can really accelerate adoption and add stability to the actual implementation teams. But then there's the McKinsey's and the Boston Consulting groups, and I think they have a role to play when it comes to educating executive management and getting the top-down buy-in and support for Agile.
Awesome. Well, I think we have come to the end of the show. Sadly, I feel like I could have this.
I know, lots more to talk about, right?
Like we just
Totally.
barely touched. But for those of you who would like to dive deeper into this, luckily, some next steps you can take is please do pick up a copy of The Agile Marketer by Roland. It's an absolutely fantastic book. If you do a Google search for the Marketing Agility podcast, subscribe to that. It's bi-weekly, right, Roland?
We're trying to do it monthly, actually.
Okay. I'm just hoping it becomes bi-weekly. But yeah, the great chance to hear, like, you guys are constantly interviewing other marketers who are putting these things into practice. So you get, real case studies. And of course, Roland writes a terrific blog at rolandsmart.com. So Roland, thank you for your time and the inspiration on agile marketing. Really great.
Scott, thanks for having me on. It's always fun to talk with you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, our next episode for Chief Martech will be in August. Stay tuned on chiefmartech.com for details. We're doing some work with a strategy consultancy called Lunati that has been doing an in-depth study of how senior marketers are setting the marketing technology agenda in their organizations, and we'll have some great statistics and cases to talk about there. So we will see you next month. Have a great summer. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.